Ryan Collins, welcome to the channel. Thank you so much for joining me. I'm really excited to chat all things SBA with you today. I want to start with an introduction. Can you tell us a little bit about yourself and Truliant?
Yeah, awesome. And thank you, Kira, for allowing me to be a part of this and to help to educate business buyers and specifically first-time business buyers. So a little bit about myself, Ryan Collins with Truliant SBA. We are a division of Truliant Federal Credit Union, which is a federal credit union based in North Carolina. We are also the number one SBA originator for 7A loans for credit unions in the United States as of fiscal year 24. As for myself, personally, located in Northeast Iowa, I come from an accounting background, but have been doing SBA 7A originations exclusively since 2018, and have really taken that time to become niche down to working with business acquisition and change of ownership financing, because it can be a bit nuanced at times, especially as you're working on uh, larger and more complex transactions, inclusion of investors, things like that. Having a lender that can understand those and digest them quickly can be critical to your transaction, and it may mean your ability to win that LOI or not, depending upon if you're competing with anybody. So again, Kira, thank you for allowing me to be part of this today, and excited to delve in more.
Yeah, thanks so much for joining me. And let me just say for people watching, you can definitely tell you have an accounting background, Ryan, just seeing you on calls with clients. I mean, every lender has their different areas of strengths, but not every lender has, I will say, an as in-depth an understanding of tax returns as you do, I've seen. And that's super helpful, is just having someone who really knows the ins and outs of that. I always really appreciate that. And so I'm really excited to pick your brain about SBA. And you mentioned, and we were chatting in our pre-call about a big focus of my channel is education. I'm a former teacher. I like people to have accurate, nuanced information. And when it comes to buying businesses, there's a lot of information on YouTube. It varies as far as how good that information is when it comes to buying and operating businesses. And it's really my goal to give people a realistic understanding of what it's like to buy a business, get financing, and operate a business. And I think that, one of the biggest questions someone has on their mind when they decide they want to buy a business is, well, what kind of business can I buy? How large of a business can I buy? What type of industry can I get into based on my experience? So I'm really curious to hear from you. For someone who's interested in buying a business, what advice do you have for them as far as figuring out what type of deal is going to be the best fit? They're looking at their personal financial statement, how much money they have in their bank, their assets, they're looking at their experience. How do they narrow down what they should be focusing on as far as their first acquisition?
Yeah, of course. So, a couple of large factors that I look for are going to be relatable experience, and then liquidity is a big driver of this. And so when I'm working with buyers and kind of educating them on the process, and either they're working on an LOI or not, um, something that I ask everybody is why this business and why now? And so the reason I do that is, of course, to have general understanding. But if the response is, well, I like this business because it generates X multiple of EBITDA, it's probably not going to be a good fit, because I need that individual to have passion in that business. That is going to be something that they're going to purchase and operate. Now, don't get me wrong. The multiple of EBITDA is important, and it's certainly a factor. But I, when I'm working with business buyers, I want them to be invested and engaged in the operations of that business, because that's only going to help amplify that multiple of EBITDA after they purchase it. And so I really want to get a gauge on what relatable experience we have, whether it be management, industry, or both. And then we can get into the numbers and making sure that it makes sense and that they're offering what's needed in the transaction.
That totally makes sense. I absolutely agree. I also kind of hear alarm bells when I hear borrowers focusing only on the financials. The financials are obviously a relevant component, obviously, right?
Right.
But are you a good fit for this business and are you going to be able to operate it is really the question. Let's get a little more specifically into liquidity. What are you looking for as a lender? You know, someone brings you a potential deal, you're looking at their personal financial statement. Do you have a certain percentage, certain number in mind that you want to see a borrower have?
Yep. So when looking at these business purchases, the overlying theme that's important to remember is that you need to have skin in the game. Now, I know that's very vague and can be transaction specific, but if an individual is wanting to buy a $5 million business and putting in $10,000, that's not skin in the game. And so for us, for me and for us at Truliant, we just take a common sense approach of like, is this a meaningful investment for this individual? So, on $1 million transaction, maybe that is, 50 grand, and then the rest is funded by seller note or investors or some combination of both. Um, but it comes down to is that we need to have some level of skin in the game from that individual, and make sure that it's meaningful to them and meaningful to the transaction. Now, that said, post-close liquidity is a big factor. So if that number that we identify is everything, that's also a problem because what hap what happens if and this isn't even a business issue, but what happens if 3 weeks after you buy the business, um, your air conditioner goes out and it's going to be 5 grand? What are you going to do? Are you going to take money from the business that we just loaned you in working capital because you don't have the liquidity? Those are some of the considerations that we're taking as a lender to make sure that we're not only setting up the business and the loan for the best security, but you personally. You're our customer, and we want you to do well. That's why we're providing financing. And so, a big factor is making sure that you do have sufficient post-close liquidity uh, to safeguard against any bumps in the road, and that may even be a personal bump in the road.
I always tell people SBA is story lending, right? Like lenders are looking at the whole picture of the transaction
Hmm.
and they're trying to answer this question of what is the likelihood I'm going to get paid back? And answering that question is not just about the financials of the business. It's about understanding your personal financials, how you're going to be as an operator, your goals. There's a lot more to it than just the balance sheet of the business.
Exactly.
So, for first time buyers specifically, I do run into a lot of folks who are lighter on liquidity. Let's say, I mean, that's relative, but let's just say for the transactions that they're pursuing, which tend to be larger, 3 million and up, they've got less than 5% of that liquid and they don't have experience in that particular industry. HVAC is super popular right now. I hear a lot of people talking about HVAC, but they've never worked in HVAC before. You know, maybe they're looking at a $4 million HVAC company. And I hear a lot of folks trying to use different strategies to mitigate their lack of experience in order to pursue these larger size SBA deals. And I want to run some of those ideas by you to see how compelling you think they are as far as mitigating lack of experience. So, one thing people will say is, well, the seller is going to hold a note. Therefore, they have skin in the game. Therefore, that makes up for my lack of experience. What do you think about that?
So, yes and no. It depends upon the size of the note. So again, it needs to be meaningful to them. Similar to the investment that you're putting into the business and your skin in the game, it needs to be meaningful to them. So if it's say a $3 million purchase and they're going to hold a $30,000 note, to me, that's not meaningful. Um, and that's something that at the first roadblock or disagreement or whatever, you walk away from it, or you could. It's not difficult to do so. So um, it's definitely a good safeguard for continued engagement from the seller. But again, it needs to be meaningful to them to really have them invested in the transaction. In the scope of a partial change of ownership, I take the same exact approach with retained equity. So you'll have some people that have, okay, we're going to do a partial change because the seller needs to carry the license and they need to stay on for longer than a year because I can't get a license for 36 months or whatever. Okay, good. That's great mitigant. But is the seller holding 1% meaningful to them? Probably not. Because again, it's not quite commiserate with the risk that you, the individual, and the lender are taking as to what they're taking. Because that 1%, could be $30,000 in a $3 million example. So the big thing is when looking at seller notes is similar to a lender's view on injection, is that we'd like to see that seller have skin in the game to keep them invested in the continued performance of the business and then ultimately the loan and the financing.
Is one or the other more compelling to you, a seller note versus retained equity? Does one over the other mitigate a borrower's lack of experience more effectively to you? Or are they the same essentially?
I would say when it comes to retention of equity, we see that used a lot to bridge licensing needs because there may be an anniversary requirement that the buyer like literally cannot meet. Point blank, I'll probably say retained equity because they see benefit in the upside in the form of their pro rata share. So if you really want them, let's use an example of a high growth company. You really want them involved to continue on that growth trajectory because ultimately, as an owner, let's say they're 10% owner, they get to see the gain and the continued gain on the improvement of that business. Whereas the seller note is going to be stagnant. It's X number of dollars that you pay to them monthly. And so the upside isn't there for the seller. And ultimately the upside isn't there for the buyer either, because the seller understands like I'm gonna get my monthly payment regardless. Whereas if they're retaining equity, there is that investment in the mutually beneficial nature to continued growth and continued profitability.
That is a misconception I think some people have about seller notes is that while you can put in performance based language, you can't structure an earnout
Right.
into a seller note.
Correct.
So your reasoning makes sense. Another point I'll hear from people is, well, I'm bringing in investors. They're not PGing, but my investors are experienced in this area, HVAC or whatever the case may be. Do you feel like that's a compelling response to a borrower's lack of experience?
Usually not. Um, Now, does it hurt the transaction? No, definitely doesn't. But something that I take into consideration with buyers is for anybody offering or that is going to be providing the personal guarantee, what do they offer to the transaction? So, are they offering licensure? Are they offering experience? Are they offering liquidity? Are they offering collateral? Are they offering all of it? If they're checking none of those boxes, then a question that I'll, push back to them is says, okay, make this make sense to me. What are you providing to this transaction, to this purchase, outside of signing the personal guarantee? If it's nothing, it's probably not a deal. And so we'll want to try and capture as many of those options as we can to make it make sense. Now, having a board of experienced individuals or a management team of experienced individuals, of course, is a great thing. But the individual that's providing the personal guarantee needs to offer something to the transaction because it's the only person that the lender has recourse on. Your management team, in the unlikely event of a liquidation, they can't help. Sure, they can pump money into the business, but they don't have to. They're not legally obligated to. The lender has no recourse on them. And so ultimately it comes back down to the individual buyer that's signing that personal guarantee, because you're the one on the hook.
Here's another one I hear. Someone's buying a business, they don't have experience in the industry, but they have a key employee in place, maybe a manager, and they've said, I have an agreement with them that they're going to stay for at least 2 years. Maybe they're not necessarily holding the license, but they are key to the business. How do you view that?
I typically would recommend the people to incentivize that individual. So provide them with equity in the new business. Give them an anniversary bonus. So at year two, you make, X bonus. At year five, you make Y, and at year 10, you make Z. Um, make that number meaningful to that person. So is it 10 grand? Is it 50 grand? It kind of depends on the size and scope of the business, but incentivize them somehow, because you hit the nail on the head. They're critical to the business, so you need them. You need them, especially in that initial transition period. Um, and so provide something to them. They are providing their experience in this transaction, and make sure that I would recommend that they give it back. The buyers give it back in some fashion.
Let's start talking about LOIs. This is one of the key documents early on in the acquisition process, and it can have a pretty significant impact on the whole transaction, how this document is set up and worded. What tips do you have for borrowers to be successful with this document?
Yeah. So this is going to come off kind of funny, but um, you want to be as absolutely clear as possible on the terms of the transaction without bearing it down with legalese. Um, because if you're throwing out, a 15-page LOI on $1 million HVAC business, odds are it's probably not even going to get looked at. Um, it's overly complex for that type of business and for the size of that business generally. And so make it clear, but also make it quick. Now, am I saying do a one-page LOI? No, definitely not. But quick and concise is best because it leaves less to ambiguity. I mean, if you're asking for a seller note, identify the terms so that they can know what's expected um, in the life of that seller note. Okay, sure, I'll put my skin in the game and I'll provide a seller note. But what type of accrued interest am I getting for that? Those are the types of things that sellers are going to take into consideration, especially if you're up against other individuals with LOIs, to say, okay, well, you know, offer A is full price with a seller note. Offer B is 5% less with no seller note. What makes the most sense here? The other thing, or another thing I would recommend is um, try and connect with the individual personally. So some of this is going to happen pre-LOI, just in your general conversations with them. But at the end of the day, ultimately, this is somebody's business, and this is generally something that they started. So this was their dream. And there's an emotional tie to that. So when you're writing in an LOI, keep that in the back of your head. This is more than a spreadsheet to them. This is more than a financial model to them. Remember that. Because ultimately, if you do win that LOI and you do close and you fund that business, it's more than a financial model to you because you're now the operator. So when you're entering into conversations and writing LOIs, keep that in the back of your head because there are people, owners, and employees behind the LOI that this is going to affect.
Business is about people. Business is absolutely about people, and people want to do business with people that they like.
Right.
And I tell people, I think that rapport with the seller is one of the most overlooked components of due diligence. That was a big thing when we sold our laundromat. Finding the right buyer was, is this someone that we feel comfortable handing our business off to?
Right.
Right. And not everyone who approached us was someone we felt that way about. People work really hard at their businesses, to your point, and they want to feel good about selling it, not necessarily just selling to the highest offer in all cases, but really feeling good about that
Right.
transaction. Let's talk a little bit about exclusivity. How do you see that playing out in LOIs, and what tips do you have for borrowers in that particular area?
Yeah, definitely. So when structuring an LOI, I always recommend to buyers to include an exclusivity clause. So essentially, what that means is once you're under LOI, you have an identified amount of time to procure financing and close before they are re-engaging the marketplace for new LOIs, new offers. And so, I'm seeing right now, especially this year, but really highlighted in the last 6 months, is a supply and demand issue. We have a huge supply of buyers and a much lesser supply of businesses. So odds are you're probably up against other buyers in those instances. And so if you do not have an exclusivity clause, legally the seller is, they can back out, you know, right after they sign for the next highest offer. And so without that legal protection, you can, be monetarily down the road and time. You can lose time down the road and it can get retraded underneath of you. And so I would recommend definitely putting in an exclusivity period, but then also making it reasonable from a timeline standpoint. SBA loans don't take 30 days. Um, so don't put in a 30-day exclusivity clause because you're going to blow through it. Um, Generally, it's 60 days, which means I would recommend an exclusivity clause of 90 days because things come up. People go on vacations, there's back and forth about the purchase agreement, kids get sick. You've got to work with a lender schedule, the lender's attorney schedule, the business valuation, your schedule, the seller. There's all a bunch of parties to these transactions. And so I always recommend asking for a little bit more. But again, keep in mind that there is a seller behind this and don't kick it out, 180 days or something obscene, because you still want to have a finish line and making sure that finish line is consistent with what your financing can achieve. But then also you and your legal or due diligence team are able to meet as well.
So let's say you've successfully submitted your LOI, it's been accepted. Now you're moving into figuring out financing. One area where I see people have some uncertainty, just not quite know kind of how to calculate it, is working capital. This is a big question for a lot of people. So I want to walk through that with you, and I'm going to pull up your spreadsheet. And maybe as I'm doing that, you can start kind of talking about, why is this something that's important to figure out early in the process?
Yeah, definitely. So when trying to identify net working capital needed in the business, it's very, very critical because whether the seller's providing it, you're getting it financed, or some combo of both, short funding the business is just as bad as overfunding. And coming from the seat of a lender, when you're 60 days post closing your acquisition and you come back to the lender asking for more money, nobody likes that phone call. It's not a fun phone call to have. So we want to make sure that we're structuring it appropriately in the first place. And so a lot of times where this can get lost, or there's a lot more gray area, is in accrual accounting based businesses. Of course, when you're working with a cash based or a POS type business, restaurants, retail, laundromat, things like that, it's a little bit easier to identify that because your turn is very quick. Cash comes in, cash
Mhm.
goes out. Um, but when you're working with those accrual type businesses that are offering terms, that's where this becomes significantly more highlighted. And so in this model that we prepared, this is an actual closing that we had earlier this year. It was about a $1.1 million transaction, and the buyer put in 5%, and so their capital investment was, I think, about $70,000. And so I say that just to give perspective as to the working capital provided, because in this example, it needed way more than they put in, and there are some lenders that are hesitant to fund working capital in excess of the injection. Um, but my view is very much that we need to appropriately fund the business, regardless of the perception of how much injection they put into the deal. The operations are what they are, and we base it off of a historical basis, and we need to fund that bridge. So, in this example, they had a very, very slow cash conversion cycle. So they were doing about $2 million top line, and were right around 450,000 in net income. And so if you look at the model provided, and this is just something that we use, so this isn't a perfect science, or it isn't law. This is just a model that I use to help to back into this. But basically, you, from a historical basis, look into, okay, how much cash expenditure do they have per day? And so in this case, it's about $4,100. We did, or the buyer's due diligence did identify that they had a 72-day cash conversion cycle. So from the first expense incurred to the last drop of revenue, generally took 72 days. That's a pretty long cash conversion cycle, which is why this business demanded so much cash. And so, um, by identifying that that cash conversion, or excuse me, the daily expenditure of $4,100, you multiply that by your cash conversion cycle, so 72, and that's where we can identify that the working capital need was about 350, or excuse me, about $300,000. And so then you would back out pro forma principal, which is that 59,000, to get to the point where we provided about $360,000 of working capital. Now, if you look in the model below, using the same business and the same numbers, that shakes out to be 12 weeks of cash. So in this example, it worked out to be exactly right at that 3-month mark. But it's not always as simple as taking the cost of goods dividing by 12 times by 3. It worked out in this example, but a lot of times, depending upon that cash conversion cycle, it can be a lot more money, or it can be a lot less. And so the biggest thing is identifying how they get paid, who's paying, and what is their cash conversion cycle. And if the sellers don't understand what cash conversion cycle is, just ask them, from the first second you are spending money on a client to the last second you get revenue, how long is that?
I think to your point, Ryan, just to highlight again, this does really speak to the amount of nuance that there is in SBA, because I have heard that from lenders of, oh, well, we can't give X amount of working capital because they're only putting in half of that to the deal, right?
Right.
And each lender is going to approach things a little bit differently. And SBA can seem like this cut and dry thing, but there really is nuance to it. So this is really helpful to go through. As we're kind of wrapping up here, I'm just curious if, in your experience with borrowers, is there any particular part of the SBA process that you feel like is commonly misunderstood, common misconceptions? You're working with a borrower and you get to a certain point, they're like, whoa, I didn't know I was going to need this in place, or I wasn't expecting this. Does anything come to mind?
I would say right off the top, two things. I kind of touched on it before, but timeline. Um, these loans don't take 30 days; they take longer than that. And so, can you close a transaction in 40 days? Yeah, you can, but it comes down to how quickly buyers and sellers and due diligence teams can provide the lender with what's needed. So um, the answer that when somebody asks me how long does this take, um, I ask right back, how quickly can you get me the documents? And then I kind of break down a typical timeline. But it really is that simple. You know, we can work, and I'll speak for myself and for Truliant. We can work as quickly as you can. The only stage where we control 100% of the timeline is underwriting. Otherwise, it's as quickly as you can provide us stuff, and it's as quickly as due diligence can be completed with legal, if there's appraisals, business valuations, third-party reports. And so that underwriting step is the only stage where the lender completely controls the timeline. And even then, there may be additional questions that we ask in underwriting, and if it's taking 5, 6, 7 days to get responses to those, it's just further elongating that. And so we very much take the approach, both in before we're issuing loan proposals, but also before it's being assigned to an underwriter, is to get absolutely everything that we can, because you want, myself or like one of our underwriters to pick up the file, digest it, and complete the work. If I'm getting half of a package and I pick it up and be, okay, I need X, Y, and Z. Um, the reality is we're all busy and we have other deals on our desk. And so I move on to the next file that is more complete because I've sent off the request for documents. Okay, I get documents back in 3 days later. I pick it back up. Well, now I got to remember what I did last time and then put in the new information. And then, oh, I'm still missing these two things. And then you're back into the circle of correspondence. That's where you lose time in deals. So if you if a lender asks for this list, provide it. There's a reason we're asking for it. I don't like collecting paperwork, but I know I need it. So I'm not going to ask for something I don't need. Um, and so that'd be an overlying tip that I have for buyers is, be prepared. Certainly, you can control your buy side documents: 3 years of taxes, resume, PFS, screenshot of your credit score. Those are easy things to do. Now, when you're looking at sell side documents, of course, you're at the mercy of them and maybe a listing broker. Um, but being as prepared as possible before engaging a lender would be a big tip for me, especially if you're on a tight timeline.
The thing I'll add to that, which may seem obvious, but I learned actually through a deal we were working on that it may not be obvious, is not only does it need to be timely, but it needs to be accurate. You need to give accurate information up front. And if you are trying to hide something, it's going to come out later, and it's going to come out at a point that's probably very inconvenient for you and the people that you're working with. It's really important to submit documentation that is honest and to put all the information up front. And especially if there are red flags, because what I found is if lenders know the red flags up front, there can be sometimes ways to work around them, but it becomes a much bigger problem when those red flags are revealed when you've already been in underwriting for a couple weeks and now we're trying to close and now people are mad because it can't work. Well, did you tell the truth up front?
Yeah, yep, you're exactly right. And you said it earlier, but you hit it on the head in that all of these SBA loans and specifically business acquisitions, they're all stories. And so if we can understand the hiccup or the bad part of the story in the forefront, great. We structure it to mitigate that as best as we can. But if you're in underwriting and you know X, Y, and Z pops up, well, you know, you've just created doubt in that underwriter's mind and everybody on that deal team. So just to be point blank and honest, I mean, we're humans. So that happens and this comes up. and you're like, oh no, that's not good. Here's how we can adjust. But in the back of your head, it's like, well, what's next? Like, are we going to have other pop-up issues? Um, and so being as complete and concise and honest as possible is the best way to go. A big thing that or something that I recommend is disclosing bankruptcies, even if they're way in the past, because we will find them. And even if it's 25 years ago, a pop-up bankruptcy in underwriting is not a good look. So tell us about it. Kind of, give us like a little bit of a explanation. The BDO will write that up, help sell it to the credit team, and we'll get on board right away. If we're not on board, then we haven't wasted anybody's time or money, and you can move on to another lender that has that capability. And you kind of hit on it before here, Kira, but something that I want to point out to business buyers is that the SBA requirements are the minimum, and every lender is going to have their differing requirements on top of that. So in this example of a bankruptcy, the SBA, they'll allow for bankruptcies, but there will be some lenders that are hard stop, no bankruptcies, and there'll be some lenders that accept it with an appropriate letter of explanation. And so if you are transparent with that upfront, let's say you're working with a lender that's a hard stop on a bankruptcy, well, you maybe just saved yourself 5 grand and 4 weeks.
It's always better to get to a fast no than a slow and drawn out no, right?
That's
Yeah.
right.
This has been a great conversation. I really appreciate your time and you sharing your knowledge. I just want to wrap up with I want to hear again, what is a Ryan deal? Do you have a particular size that you work in, particular industries you like? And then what's the best way for people to get in touch with you?
Yeah. And thank you again, Kira. I'm very grateful to do this, and I love the education that you provide to business buyers, because there's a lot out there. Um, some of it's good, and some of it is not quite as good. And I think you're doing an incredible job on educating appropriately. As far as where to find me, LinkedIn's going to be the best spot. I'm very, very active there. And so just search me, Ryan Collins. It'll pop up. And as far as transactions, definitely nationwide business acquisitions, 1 to 5 million. Um, I'm industry agnostic, so I'll look for anything. I really two things. Um, does it make sense from an experience standpoint? And does it cash flow?
Those are the two big questions I know on really all lenders' minds, and borrowers have to think about it. It's not just about, is this a great business? Is this a great business for you right now, based on your whole situation and your set of experiences? So this was
Exactly.
a great conversation, Ryan. I really appreciate it, and looking forward to doing some more deals with you in the future. And thanks so much for coming on to educate our viewers.
Awesome. Thank you. All the same.
If you like this content, make sure to subscribe and check out the links in my show notes for ways to get in touch with me to discuss your business acquisition deal.